This is so disorienting, like talking to my laptop. I'm sure everyone has said that, but just, okay, this will be weird. I'm going to talk about testing in production. TLDR, you should do it. Well, the real TLDR is you already do it. Everyone does it. The only difference is some people admit it and specifically try to do better at it. Thank you for the lovely introduction. My name is Charity. I was co-author of Database Reliability Engineering. You'll notice it has a unicorn on the cover. If you happen to have the book and you need a unicorn for your cover, let me know. I will send you a sticker. And you can tell that I'm from operations because this is how I feel about software. The only good diff is a red diff, otherwise known as junior engineers write code, senior engineers delete code. Red diffs. Woo, woo. Testing in production has gotten a bad rap. I was really surprised at the backlash that I got when I started talking about this because I thought that this was very obvious. Obviously, you have to test in production. Most interesting bugs will never be findable in any kind of staging environment. But this is not apparently obvious. So we're going to talk about it. I blame this guy. It's a great meme. It's probably one of my favorites. Unfortunately, it's wrong, right? And it's a false dichotomy. For one thing, there's this implication that if you test in production, that means that you don't test in any other ways. Testing in production does not mean that you can't or don't test the hell out of it before you ship. It's not like there's a number on the limit on the number of tests you can run, but you have a limited amount of energy and time. Engineering cycles are the scarcest resource in our universe. People love to tell us what not to do with our time. It's harder to tell people what you should do. But honestly, the myth of, that we don't test in prod is getting harder and harder to sustain because so much of what we're doing is changing too. I've begun thinking and talking a lot about this in terms of observability driven development. TDD is great. TDD is, probably the most influential software, innovation of my lifetime. But it stops at the border of your laptop, right? It achieves its predictability and its, replayability by carefully abstracting away everything under the reality umbrella, right? If it's interesting, you mock it out because the whole point of tests is that you can, replay them, that they are, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking on the word. You know what I'm saying? They're never going to change, right? They are completely predictable, which means that they shouldn't be interesting, right? They shouldn't be interesting at all. So what do you test before production? All of this is table stakes, right? Please do not go away and say that I'm telling you not to test, because it's important to do this stuff, mostly because it helps us catch regressions, mostly because, these are the failures. If you catch them with your tests, it's such an obvious dumb failure that you will kick yourself if you end up shipping it to prod. So don't, right? Climb with a net. So what do you have to test in production? Well, anything that qualifies in my mind as interesting, right? Not all failures are created equal. In fact, most failures should never trigger a monitoring alert. Those should be reserved for, the ones where your users are unmistakably in pain. You can't live your life tweaking fucking monitoring alerts. this is where stuff gets interesting. And it's interesting to look at the fact that, this mirrors the shift from monitoring to observability in my mind. It's about moving from a world of mostly known unknowns where you had the same failures happening like over and over, and you could just like rely on your library of past outages in your head and your dashboards. These are the known unknowns, right? And increasingly, you're not getting paged about things that you already understand. You're not getting paged about things you can just refer to your run book. It's unknown unknowns. These are things that have probably never happened before, may never happen again, right? They might be very subtle. You might have to be looking for it to see it. Welcome to distributed systems, right? Here on the left, you can see this is the lamp stack diagram on the left. Remember the good old days when like the application, monolithic application, and the database, right? In the middle, that was a parse infrastructure diagram from about 6 or 7 years ago. Modest, pretty complex, right? But like, and on the right, that is our national electrical grid. And that's, when I was at Facebook, this is the kind of thing that we should have in our minds when we're thinking about architecture and infrastructure increasingly, right? It is chaotic. It's ephemeral. Things blip in and out of existence. It's dynamic. You cannot predict what's going to happen. You can't even predict what it's going to look like tomorrow. A tree falls over in the middle of Main Street in some small town in Iowa. How much energy should you have put into predicting that would happen and writing a monitoring check for it and then, tweaking your thresholds? No, you shouldn't. You should rely on your instrumentation being rich and enabling you to swiftly diagnose it, narrow it down, resolve it, and move on. And the reason for this, of course, is that complexity is just off the charts, as you can tell by my very scientific diagram here. Complexity is increasing, and therefore our ability to predict and control outcomes is dwindling. Now, you will need observability to test in production responsibly. This is not to say that you can't test in production irresponsibly. I will often say that, chaos engineering without observability is just chaos. Because if you're just shipping stuff and then waiting for your monitoring checks to go off, or if you're finding things weeks later that are a relic of your tests, you're maybe not tall enough to ride this ride. You should be able to. And you need observability, and I'm not taking observability in the bullshit definition that all of the monitoring and metric companies who are we do observability too now. No, you don't. It's not the same. I've put a lot of energy into if you accept my definition of, it's about unknown unknowns, it's about being able to ask any question and understand any internal state of your system without having to ship new code to handle that state. If you accept that definition, a lot of technical requirements fall out of that. And I've written about it a lot. It's in that link if you want to see it. But a couple of these things that are really key for our purposes here are the source of truth cannot be metrics. Metrics, with tags, they have discarded the connective tissue of the event at write time, and you can never get it back. Which means you can never deploy and break down by, this is build ID and this is build ID n+1. Show me all of the different dimensions for all of the requests, and break them down so that I can see what the differences are. You can't do that kind of a query with a metrics-based monitoring system. There can't be any pre-aggregation, because you need access to those raw events. Pre-aggregation, again, you can only ask the questions you could predict wanting to ask, etc. And high cardinality is especially not nice to have. You must be able to, and high cardinality, by that I mean, cardinality is the number of unique items in a set. So imagine you have a collection of 100 million users, and the highest possible cardinality would be any unique ID. So social security number, or, request ID. First name, last name are very high cardinality, but not quite as high. Low cardinality would be gender, right? Or species is human. right? So high cardinality is not a nice to have. Like, you must be able to, break down by a chain of high cardinality dimensions in order to ask these really fine-grained questions that allow you to see the impact of the changes that you have shipped to production. Like, as you can see, these are not mutually exclusive. Things that you want to test in production, load test. I have some friends who run a 20% load test at all times in production. It's great because whenever they run into a scaling ceiling, they can spin it down and they've got 20% extra, right? There's something to be said for that. Like, no one is ever going to pay for an observability stack that costs as much as production. They're just not, right? And even if you did, say you're Facebook and you spin up a copy of Facebook to test Facebook, right? You're never going to do it, but say you did. Even then, you run into like the Michael Jackson problem where he only died once. you can capture 24 hours worth of traffic and replay it against the same hardware, with the representative, concurrency, reconstructed transactions, all that stuff. You can do this, and I have done this 3 times. I have written this piece of software for 3 different databases, for MySQL and for MongoDB. Even if you capture replay, it's the gold standard. You still can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow. Experiments, behavioral tests, testing on your users, I highly recommend it. It's good for the soul. Multi-region stuff, some things are just too big to test. But this is not to say that we shouldn't be investing in the tooling around what we're doing here. I actually feel like almost all of us have some ground to catch up here when it comes to hardening, beefing up our tool set for engineers who need to do progressive deployments, canaries, stage multiple versions, auto-generate, views, compare various versions, reap older versions, etc. Staging is not production. Perhaps that's somewhat obvious. I just said that. It's really easy to get dragged down into bike shedding about cloning environments. But honestly, staging environments are a black hole for engineering time. It's so tempting to people to just, when they're scared about something, the safe answer always seems to be to put more energy into production. But just because it's safe doesn't mean it's free. It is incredibly costly for your time, especially considering that you're chasing a moving target that you will never catch. It's like Zeno's paradox, Zeno's staging area, right? It will never be production. And past a certain point, all of the energy that you put into it is pointless. Deploy code is production code. I feel like at most companies, deploy code is kind of the ugly stepchild, neglected. Deploy code rots just as fast as your other code. Only production is production. This is one reason, for people who want to argue ad infinitum, you can always point out that look, there is an irreducible amount of complexity here. You can only verify, you can't test this command, right? You can only run that command for real. Testing deploy code is one of the hardest things to do for this reason. You kind of have to test in the environment that you are running on. As anyone who's ever typoed their environment knows, this is an irreducible test. What was I going to say there? Deploy code is... I don't remember what I was going to say. Shit. Okay. Whatever. Deploy tools themselves are interesting to test. Yeah. You have a limit. Oh, right. You have a limited amount of developer cycles and energy, right? You simply do. And for people who balk at testing in production and who just want to sink it all into staging, I'm not arguing. Well, okay, so I might be arguing for getting rid of staging altogether. I'm not necessarily arguing for it, but for a lot of people, for everything except for like UI UX changes, yeah, I kind of am. But let's say that I'm not. What I am arguing is that you have a fixed number of developer cycles, and most of you are starving your production systems and over investing in staging. And I would simply encourage you to like move some of those to invest in hardening your tooling around production, because that energy is perhaps the best spent energy that you can spend. That was awkwardly put. Katie McCaffrey has this great Papers We Love talk about where she shows she's a computer scientist. I'm not a computer scientist. I am a dropout music major. Believe Katie. Katie shows, like with math and shit, that you can catch 80% of the bugs with 20% of the effort. And you should. That sounds pretty great to me. Failure is definitely when, not if, or rather lots and lots and lots and lots of wins. And the more you practice it, ironically, the better you will get at it. And by better, I mean, like, resiliency is not about making it so that you don't fail. Resiliency is about making it so that you can fail a lot and your users never notice. And that takes practice. It really does. Another thing that really bugs me is people spending so much time in just tinkering with fucking staging when they honestly can't even tell if their own production environment is healthy or not. When they can't tell what the difference is between the changes they just shipped and the changes that were live. When they don't have the tooling to like ship a canary and promote and do like staged rollouts so that it's progressively rolling out, right? Like you need the ability. Honestly, every developer should be able to like ship a canary host of their own and watch it like intently. You should have the ability to have multiple versions in production that shouldn't interfere with each other. If multiple people are doing this, it should automatically revert back to, you know, the pinned base version after a certain amount of idle time. And it should increase the percentage from like, you know, a single host to like 5%, 10%, 25%, 50%. Do not jump from 50% to 100%, because that's how you test your load, right? The internal load for your services. That's how you give internal services the time to auto scale up if you're using auto scaling triggers. Most people actually don't know nearly enough about. Most people's observability sucks. I feel like this is kind of a tipping point. This is a point of no return for inviting software engineers into production, asking them to make themselves at home, telling them it's safe, nobody's going to yell at them, and it's time to learn to own their shit from end to end. Which is why it's worth asking yourself, does everybody know what normal looks like? It's not enough to know, you know, if you think something's wrong and you jump into production and you haven't looked at it in a couple of weeks, honestly, if you don't look at it every day, you should be up to your elbows in production every day, because if you only look at it when something's broken, you don't know what normal is. I believe that everyone who has the ability to merge to what are we calling it now, trunk, should have the ability to deploy, to roll back, to get it to a known good state, to canary, and how to debug in production. Practice makes perfect. So instead of this, maybe this. I mean, release engineering is a systematically underinvested in skill set at companies. I think every company I know of with over 50 people. Your deploys are the proximate cause of nearly all your failures because they inject chaos into your system. Having a staging copy of production is not going to do much to change that, and it adds a large category of problems, colloquially named as it looked just like production, so I just dropped that table. Always make your prompts look very different, right? The tools that you need to test and prod are basically just the same tools that you need to do really high quality releases. For example, investing in these is unequivocally a good use of your time. Staging, not so much. So, in conclusion, tonight we test and prod. Once upon a time, like, these were optional skills and even specialties. Not anymore. I feel like, the first wave of DevOps, and to be clear, I don't see DevOps as a new thing. I see it as returning to our roots originally. Like, there was no divide in the beginning. You wrote code and you owned it, right? Now we specialize. Cool, right? And the first wave of DevOps was really about ops people. You must learn to write code. Like, okay, like, message received, right? But now, like, the pendulum has really started to swing back, and now I think it's really about, okay, software engineers, it's your turn. It's your turn now. Like, these are no longer optional. If you're a distributed systems engineer, if you're working on a system where one of its most salient characteristics is its distributedness, operability is key. Like, this is table stakes for you. You cannot do your job without this. Consider buying tools. There are a lot of developer tools out there that are dedicated to building these shiny tools for you so that you can focus on your core competency. Hi. You can now construct a very nice pipeline for yourself that looks very much like what you would use at Google or Facebook, just from tools that are available for free or a couple $100 a month, unless you get really big. And I have some more memes. I always test my code, and then I test it again against production. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I don't see any questions on this stage.
No questions.
No questions at the moment. I'll leave it a minute or two for things to catch up in case there's anyone.
I probably went to sleep.
Depends what time zone they're in. Cool.
The backlash against testing in production was fierce in the beginning, but it seems to have calmed down. And I can't tell if that's because everybody's like over it or everybody's just like accepted it. I can't tell.
Cool. No questions. Lots of clapping and rounds of applause.
All right. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. Last one come in. It said, could you give some examples for cases where a staging system is useful?
Testing your UI changes, like visual layout stuff. Like, there's no replacement for just looking at it. And I mean, you should always run your, database upgrades on, you should have some combination of, a CI/CD test pipeline, and I like at Honeycomb, we have what we have is we have production, then we have another copy of Honeycomb that monitors Honeycomb called dog food, and then another one that monitors dog food called kibble. And we use those as kind of like our staging environments, even though we use them for real things because they are kind of a copy of, and then we have a thing where each developer can, run a command that spins up a Dockerized container version of production so that they can look at changes visually. But like running database upgrades a couple of times, a couple of places before you turn them loose on prod, super good idea. But otherwise, mostly visual stuff.
Cool. And that was the last question. So thank you very, very much, Charity. I'm glad this time we went without technical.
I know.
And to everyone else out there, we'll be back in 5 minutes with our last presentation. Thank you.